for coming to this seminar of Embrace Dialogue Academia. We are delighted to have you here. My name is Andrei Gomez, and I would like to make very short remarks to welcome you on behalf of Rodemos el Diálogo. We're delighted to have this partnership with Merton College. This is the third seminar of this series, and the last one this term, and is on a very timely issue, Coca and Capitalism in Cauca. And it's very timely because, as we all know, the situation in Colombia, in these regions, in the coca production regions, has deteriorated rapidly. We even got a communique this morning from one of the regional platforms in Putumayo, Nariño, and Cauca, explaining how the situation is very complicated in security terms, how they are suspending all their activities related with peace building because the space for their peace building work is restricted. So there couldn't be a more timely issue, and we put our voice of solidarity out there, thinking on these communities and reflecting critically to see how we can help from these academic spaces. Rodemos el Diálogo is a peace building organization that has very many different teams, some of them working on thematic issues such as transitional justice and reincorporation of the Farc. We also do some research in terms of identity and culture, and we have a very special team called Embrace Dialogue Academia. That is a team of academics who is precisely running this series, and in this term, Gwen is the convener of this seminar series. And this is trying to bring academics to reflect critically on contemporary issues to try to promote better understanding of how to approach peace building in Colombia. In this work that we do in Rodemos el Diálogo, we have 6 principles that we want to share with you before I hand over to Gwen, who is going to chair this meeting. The first principle is the principle of solidarity. We want to be there for the people in Colombia. We know we are part of a bigger community, and we want to make sure that we contribute to that. The second principle is honesty. This is a space of trust. We want to create a very honest space to share what you think and your fears and concerns. The third principle is generosity. We are going to be here for maximum 2 hours, and we expect to give the best of ourselves. The fourth principle has to do with co-responsibility. We feel that from wherever we can always share responsibility to build a better world. The fifth principle is self-criticism, and is that we expect that we can change our own prejudices and also understand our limited understanding of what's happening and probably think of better solutions. And the final principle is respect. Know that we come from different paths in life, and that it's fine to have differences, but it's upon difference that we can build a better world. So we invite you to do that. We invite you to check our website, where we have different publications of the things that we do. And now I hand over to Gwen for the chairing of this very special seminar.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you all so much for coming. It's really wonderful to see so many people interested at this point in the year. I know it's a long term, a long year in this really important issue. So thank you for joining us. I'm really delighted today to have as our special guests Anthony Dest, who is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Lehman College in the City University of New York. And as a discussant, Dr. María Clemencia Ramírez, Research Associate and former Director of the Colombian Institute of Anthropology and History, the ICUN. And this series of Embrace Dialogue Academia seminars precisely seeks to bring together academics working on different issues of peace and conflict in Colombia with a view to having discussions that can contribute to policy debates in contemporary peace building issues in Colombia. So we're trying to have discussions that can help us to think through how we can make this research useful on the ground to contribute to the long road and bumpy road to peace in Colombia. And as an anthropologist myself, I'm particularly pleased to have 2 anthropologists here today to help us think through that discussion as to what anthropology can contribute to discussing policy challenges. And we're going to have, the format is going to be as follows. Anthony is going to give his presentation for about 25 minutes based on his paper, which you can find in the event details Eventbrite page. If anyone wants to read the full version afterwards, I hope they will. And then María Clemencia will comment, specifically trying to draw out the implications of this paper for the contemporary challenges to peace building in Colombia. And it's going to be really interesting as well, because Anthony's paper is based on Cauca, and María Clemencia, as many of you will know, is an expert on the Putumayo region, which has very similar but different problematics associated with the frontier on the drug issue. So that's going to be a really enriching conversation. And then we will open out to a dialogue with the audience, and you are all encouraged to spend the talk thinking about the comments and questions you would like to ask. You are encouraged to do so yourself, and I will ask you to write me, or I have a comment, or I have a question in the chat box, so that I can give you the chance to speak, in which point you can turn your microphone on and your camera on. In the meantime, if you could try to keep your microphones off to avoid any audio interference, that would be fantastic. And with that, we will then hopefully manage to do maybe one or two at least rounds of comments and questions and feedback to both Anthony and María Clemencia before bringing it to close after about an hour and a half to an hour and 40 minutes. And we are live streaming, so please bear that in mind. And I think Herman, who, thank you very much, Herman, for helping us with all of the technological aspects of this today. I think Herman is going to place the link to the YouTube recording in the chat, along with our own social media website and things. So Rodemos el Diálogo for anyone who is interested. And so on behalf of Merton College and Rodemos el Diálogo, I'm extremely pleased to welcome you all today to this talk. So without further ado, Anthony, I will pass over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Gwen. Thank you, Rodeamos el Diálogo, Merton College.
Anthony, I think you're sharing your document as well as your PowerPoint.
Oh, no. That's not good.
You can. We don't mind, but
no,
I think it's not what you're intending.
No. I'm just trying to do this. How about now?
Perfect.
Great. Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you very much, Gwen, Rodeemos el Diálogo, Merton College, and Professor Ramírez for making the time to have this talk. And I really appreciate the work that goes into everything that y'all are doing. And I look forward to continuing this discussion after the presentations. And thanks especially to Gwen, who I met back in 2012 in Curvarado and Apartado. It's really great to continue these conversations almost a decade later. So with that, I'll get started. My article, The Coca Enclosure, is part of a special issue that I'm currently co-editing for World Development with Laura Sauls and Kendra McSweeney on the role of illicit economies in transforming Latin America's rural spaces. It's based on many years of research and activism in Colombia, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about why I wrote it, as well as some of the methodological and ethical challenges in doing so. Throughout the presentation, I'll cover some of the main findings from the piece, but it is available, as Gwen mentioned, on the link provided in the invitation. So in hindsight, one of the most surprising aspects of this article for me is that I never set out to write about drugs or drug trafficking. Over the years of my research, it's mostly focused on supporting Black and Indigenous struggles against racism, violence, and dispossession throughout the Pacific region of Colombia. And although the drug war loomed in the background and always was central to my analysis of the conjuncture, it never quite seemed to reveal itself openly. This might be attributed to the secrecy and the potential shame associated with participating in illicit activities, but I think it probably has more to do with the reluctance of many of us to address drug trafficking directly. The costs for doing so are extraordinarily high, and good strategies are in short supply for doing so. Drug traffickers don't need to and they don't tend to respect the Black and Indigenous demands for autonomy and self-determination, and they often resort to violence as a means for silencing dissent. Asking for recourse from the state, on the other hand, typically results in more militarization and more violence. So being too closely associated with either the state or the traffickers can lead to dangerous suggestions and accusations of collaboration or being a snitch, right? And as a consequence, many Black and Indigenous movements that I work with have refrained from openly confronting drug traffickers or seeking support from the state. Instead, they rejected the premises of the drug war, fumigations, and other US-sponsored interventions in their territory. After the 2016 peace accords, however, things seemed to change a bit. And there seemed to be an opportunity to finally gain a degree of control over the expansion of drug trafficking in the communities. The Farc's disarmament and the creation of the National Comprehensive Program for the Substitution of Illicit Crops, or the BENIS, which was created by Chapter 4 of the Accords, offered a chance to meaningfully engage with people about what they wanted for their communities. In Northern Cauca, that meant that we could travel to many places that were previously off limits because, at least for a short time, it was safe to do so. Beginning in August 2016, I participated in many community meetings throughout Northern Cauca as a member of the autonomous monitoring mechanism of the Ethnic Commission for Peace and in Defense of Territorial Rights, based on my long-term solidarity work with the Black Communities Process, or PCN, in the US and in Colombia. The Ethnic Commission, as a coalition of Black and Indigenous social movements, struggles to ensure that Black and Indigenous rights are respected during the implementation of the peace accords. And through this work in Northern Cauca, we quickly learned that people were most interested in hearing about chapters 1 and 4 of the peace accords, which addressed issues related to land reform and drug trafficking, respectively. And given the tenuous standing of the accords, a lot of folks at these meetings were wondering out loud about whether or not the implementation of the accords would actually happen. But the possibility of potentially gaining resources from the state or minimizing the risks associated with cultivating coca, or that served as an impetus for them to participate in these meetings. And during these meetings, I started to get the sense that I was missing a big part of what was going on. Limiting my focus to the legal rights of Black and Indigenous communities and their strategies for recognition was not going to provide me with the analytical tools or the ethnographic sensibilities that I needed to grasp the intricacies of the drug war in Northern Cauca. Prior to beginning my research in Colombia, the signing of the peace accords was obviously not a certainty. I'm talking early 2016 and beforehand. And I had been planning to live in the Afro-Colombian Community Council of Nuevo Amanecer, which I should make clear from the beginning is a pseudonym for obvious safety reasons. By working in this community, I hope to distance myself from explicitly activist spaces that I was familiar with and gain a better understanding of how people lived in the region. And while listening to the people at the meetings organized by the Ethnic Commission and spending more time in Nuevo Amanecer, I came to understand that I had been conflating the demands of the organizations with the aspirations of their supposed constituents living in the communities of Northern Cauca. In The Land Is Ours Now, Wendy Wolford calls this process of conflation subject elision. And I find this formulation to be very productive for reflecting on how I missed something so seemingly obvious, right? As I mentioned earlier, the movements and organizations had good reasons for keeping drug trafficking at a distance, but avoiding the issue meant sidelining one of the most important aspects of people's everyday lives. And the coca boom in Northern Cauca might have started years before I began working in the region in 2010, but it wasn't until 2016 that I started to learn more about the gravity of how these transformations were changing the communities that I thought I was so familiar with. So in order to illustrate the depths of these changes, I will draw from my experiences and the stories that I heard in Nuevo Amanecer. Formerly founded in the early 2000s, the Afro-Colombian Community Council of Nuevo Amanecer's original membership included just a few families. They learned about the potential benefits of organizing themselves as a community council from Black social movements with a historic presence in the region, organizations like PCN or RACON. However, interest in membership did not swell in the community council until the military threatened to forcibly eradicate the coca cultivations in the area in 2009. Which at that point were increasing considerably. And I'll show a chart later on that demonstrates this. According to one member of the community council, who I believe was the legal representative at the time, he said, quote, "People started to join the community council when the military came in because they said that the only way to protect the territory was by being indigenous or Afro, or by being recognized as either one of those two, because they have a special recognition or something like that, where the military can't show up as if it were just a peasant zone without any, how can I say it? Well, without being tied to an important organization, end quote. In order to build a potential safeguard against a forced eradication by the military, a lot of the Black and indigenous folks from the region signed up to join the community council during this forced eradication campaign, but they weren't the only ones to do so. By 2009, several families of colonos cocaleros, or coca growing settlers from other parts of the country, signed up to become part of the Afro-Colombian Community Council as well. Unlike the founding members of the Community Council, these colonos cocaleros arrived in the region in the mid-2000s, searching for a recondite place to grow coca after state-led eradication efforts forced several of them out of their homes in other parts of the country. Although very few, if any, of these colonos cocaleros self-identified as Black, they believed that the Community Council could provide an extra layer of protection against government counter-narcotic policies, because Black communities have the legal right to free, prior, and informed consultation and consent. The legal representative of the Afro-Colombian Community Council at the time, as I mentioned, welcomed these newcomers because he thought that the Community Council could harness this explosion of interest in order to defend the community's rights. But the protests against the forced eradication in 2009 continued, and they ultimately reached a settlement with the government after 2 weeks of negotiating. The troops retreated, and the government's civilian authorities promised to implement a series of state-supported programs that would provide the communities with incentives like credits and roads in order to encourage the cocaleros to voluntarily substitute their illicit crop, much like what's going on with Chapter 4 of the Peace Accords. The government never made good on its promises, however. Again, much like the Peace Accords. And the cocaleros, in turn, continued to profit from their illicit crops. So none of that got resolved, right? But what's important for me is that the Community Council now confronted a dilemma. It could no longer convene enough of its members to hold an official assembly because the colonos cocaleros now found little use in engaging with the Community Council. During the protest, the official membership of the Community Council grew from just 25 families to over 250. That's like 10 times as big as it was. And according to the internal regulations of the Community Council, they needed at least half of the registered members to participate in a meeting in order to hold quorum or to make decisions about the direction of the community. And this inability to make decisions effectively stalled the Community Council's ability to function as an administrator or even defend the territorial rights of the community, right? Today, the community continues to confront a similar situation. People in the region say, La Coca convoca, or coca convenes, because meetings related to the substitution of coca or the eradication of the crop summoned so many more folks than meetings related to unreliable teachers or repairing washed out roads. Even topics like the possibility of acquiring a collective land title tend to elicit ambivalence, if not outright resistance, from community members. But how did it get like this? Who were these outsiders, and why did the arrival of coca play such a big role in transforming the community, especially considering the impressive ability of social movements from the region to inspire and organize? I think playing Colombia helps us understand why things changed. As part of its decades-long promotion of the so-called war on drugs, the United States government pumped well over $10 billion of primarily military aid into Colombia as part of its apparent strategy to stem the flow of cocaine from the country. During the 2000s, the war on drugs fused with the war on terror as the conflict in Colombia deepened. Meanwhile, Plan Colombia's flagship policy of aerial fumigations wiped out tens of thousands of hectares in spite of humanitarian concerns by locals and international organizations. The policy basically consisted of dumping toxic glyphosate from airplanes over huge swaths of the jungle, for those of y'all who might not be familiar with these fumigations. And according to the victims of the fumigations, the glyphosate caused health problems and left them hungry after it destroyed the crops that they depended on to survive. A report prepared for the Brookings Institution indicated that, quote, the most conservative evaluation shows that for each hectare sprayed with glyphosate, coca crops are reduced by 0.02 and 0.065 hectares, end quote. This ecologically destructive and wildly inefficient policy was a failure even by its own standards of supply-side eradication. Even so, it continues to be pushed by these mano dura adherents of the policy in both Colombia and in the United States. The deepening of neoliberal reforms in tandem with counter-narcotics and counterinsurgency military operations of the last few decades has resulted in what critics call the depeasantization of the countryside, and it exemplifies what Paley calls drug war capitalism. The regions vacated by coca growers and non-coca growers alike as a consequence of forced eradications were subject to land grabs by multinational corporations and private sector interests in cattle ranching, extractive industries, and expansion of crops used for the production of agrofuels like oil palm or sugarcane. Between 2000 and 2016, U.S. foreign direct investment in Colombia increased nearly tenfold, from $202.5 million to over $2 billion, as these forms of dispossession spread throughout Colombia. Yet, it bears emphasis that just because the drug war temporarily cut into coca cultivations, it did not keep people from growing coca or participating in drug trafficking. Instead of giving up their livelihoods, the coca growers just moved somewhere else, right? On this chart on the left on the slide, I pulled together statistics from the United Nations Office on Drug Control, or the UNODC, to illustrate the movement of crops during Plan Colombia and beyond. Here you can see how the supposed gains were temporary at best, and how the coca cultivations exploded in the Pacific region of Colombia, which is inhabited primarily by Black and indigenous peoples. So, the coca boom that struck various parts of the country as a consequence of the displacement caused by Plan Colombia did not make it to Northern Cauca until the mid-2000s, as I mentioned earlier. But when it did, the locals didn't refer to these newly arrived people as colonos, the way that many scholars of agrarian issues in Colombia typically refer to the settlers, somewhat heroically, I might add. Instead, they call them foráneos, or outsiders, or llegaderos, arrivants. Sometimes the locals refer to the foráneos also as pastusos, in reference to Pasto, the capital of the department in Nariño, where many of these settlers are believed to have migrated from starting in the early 2000s. At first, these foráneos trickled into Nuevo Amanecer, buying up land at low prices. The locals feared that the swelling coca cultivations were going to eventually attract the military and other armed actors, but within just a few months, a majority of the people from the community worked on these newcomers' bountiful coca farms. And during the crowded meetings about the implementation of Chapter 4 of the Peace Accords in 2016 and 2017 that I was a part of, these foráneos would show up en masse and sit quietly in the back of the room as they listened to the content of the meetings, right? But they never participated. Meanwhile, the Black and indigenous authorities that facilitated these meetings couldn't kick them out, right? And that option wasn't even discussed because the presence of the foráneos at the meetings represented the threat of force. The foráneos' benefactors, i.e. the drug traffickers, though rarely visible or identifiable, possess the capacity to exert violence with impunity in the event that they perceived an individual or community challenging their control over their territory. As such, they threaten the authority of the Afro-Colombian community councils and indigenous resguardos, as well as other community-based organizations in their area. I want to stress that by calling the coca-growing settlers foráneos, the inhabitants of Northern Cauca draw attention to the imposition of an outside force on their way of life, right? So coca cultivation functions as a form of internal colonialism in the Black, indigenous, and campesino communities in the peripheries of Northern Cauca. Although the case of the coca-growing settlers might seem at odds with the project of the nation state, the effects of drug trafficking actually accelerate processes of internal colonialism in Northern Cauca in three different ways. One, by deepening capitalist relations and cutting off subsistence-oriented economies and appealing to the fast life of drug trafficking, or what some local leaders call the anti-culture of coca. Two, drawing in the military apparatus of the state and subjecting the communities to the violence associated with drug trafficking. And three, containing the demands of the Afro-Colombian community councils and indigenous cabildos and resguardos. I first heard someone refer to the anti-culture of coca during a two-day assembly organized by the Ethnic Commission in October of 2016. Our meeting was just 15 minutes down the road from one of the Farc's temporary encampments, as the guerrilla group was still in the process of formally moving into their reintegration camp. The 100 or so Black and Indigenous people in attendance broke out into 6 small groups to discuss the various aspects of the accords, as well as one group that would focus exclusively on the ethnic chapter. Many of the participants there wanted to hear about Chapter 4 of the Peace Accords because they grew coca themselves or worked as raspachines picking coca leaves for cash on somebody else's farm. Other participants included community leaders that were concerned about the growing influence of coca in their communities. Julio, one young leader from Nuevo Amanecer, spoke about what he called the anti-culture of coca by comparing the coca-growing foraños and drug traffickers to multinational corporations. He said, quote, "They arrive without invitation. They don't conduct a prior consultation. They exploit the land, and they just leave when they're done. Who fits the bill? We do. ¿Quién paga por los platos rotos? Nosotros." For Julio, the anti-culture of coca was insidious because it transformed the moral fiber of the community. He talked about how the communities used to be peaceful places where people worked together in collective mingas, celebrated local customs, and provided the food that they needed to survive. Coca changed everything. The anti-culture of coca brought in by the foraños, according to Julio, led to the expansion of prostitution, alcoholism, violence, gambling, drug consumption, materialism, and individualism in the communities. Although Julio did not discuss the spiritual and cultural uses of coca by indigenous peoples and others at this meeting, he later told me that the coca plant itself was not antithetical to community life. For him, the anti-culture of coca specifically related to the cultivation of coca for the creation of cocaine. Yet, for other folks from the region whose earnings depended on cultivating coca, it represented, if not a shot at buying a washing machine or building a brick and mortar home, it was at least a means of enduring the precarity associated with decades of neoliberal reforms and violence in the countryside. For them, the critique of the anti-culture of coca espoused by social movement leaders was laudable as an aspirational ethic, but it wasn't a realistic possibility. Of course, they publicly lamented the gradual loss of customs like cambio de mano, but from the roadside vendor that sells empanadas and mazamorra to the baggage handler on the chiva that loads precursor chemicals onto the top of the bus, ordinary people had more cash in their pockets as a result of the coca boom economy. Coca extends the promise of a better life, or at least a life where material wants and needs appear more attainable, by feeding on what Burnyeat might call cruel optimism. And I think that this cruel optimism appears somewhat comically in the meme that you can see on the slide right now from a friend that lives in northern Cauca. I got this last week. And so above the coca field nestled in the Andes, the text refers to a vallenato song by Binomio de Oro. And it says, I wanted to cultivate love, but I'd be better off cultivating coca. And so I think this meme encapsulates both Julio's critique of the anti-culture of coca, as well as the response of the coca growers that turned to the crop looking for a quick fix to resolve their economic precarity. One foraño from Nuevo Amanecer, or a foraño that chose to live in Nuevo Amanecer, told me this in 2017. I used to have coca, and as you can see, I substituted it for coffee. Sometimes I still work with coca if the situation requires it. You've got to, because providing 3 kids with an education and wanting them to get ahead, well, sometimes you can't take care of everything with what you've got, and you've got to go work with coca. The truth is that coca is good economically, but if you look at the results and its final product, cocaine, then it's not. So that's why I don't grow coca. If it were up to me, I'd never grow coca again. It's been 3 or 4 years since I've had my own coca plants. Now I don't have any and I've survived. I see my neighbors and they have a lot of coca, but they really don't have anything. Sometimes they even ask to borrow money. So I start to think, what are we doing? In conclusion, coca is not new to Northern Cauca, or even the Afro-Colombian Community Council of Nuevo Amanecer. One person from Nuevo Amanecer recalled an old man who used to keep 5 bushes of coca, nothing like the ones you see now, he said. They were much bigger than the efficiently organized shrubs that people currently harvest, like the ones you saw in that meme. The old man sold the old leaves to the indigenous folks that would come down from the mountains and buy it to mambiar, or to chew. Coca staved off hunger. The drug war changed that. It made people hungrier. In Critical Thought in the Face of the Capitalist Hydra, the Zapatistas argue, quote, the wasteland resulting from a war is also a commodity, as is its reconstruction. It's as if they were colonizing a totally new territory, such that they could organize it however they wanted, as if from scratch, end quote. This keen reflection from the Zapatistas on contemporary forms of primitive accumulation offers a reminder of the centrality of violence in producing capital and transforming social relations. The so-called peace accords hardly conceal the ongoing conflict over commodities and futures in Colombia. Colonization by cocaleros deepens capitalist relations in Nuevo Amanecer and reshapes the community's racial formation. The resulting tension between A, the prospect of earning more money by working with coca, and B, confronting the transformations associated with what Julio calls the anti-culture of coca, represent challenges for the Afro-Colombian Community Council of Nuevo Amanecer, especially considering that coca serves as a major mobilizing force in the community and the foraños control much of the coca production. This underscores the uncomfortable contradictions facing the Community Council, because many of its own constituents now doubt one of its ostensible premises, acquiring a collective land title. For example, two concerned men took me aside after a meeting in 2016, and they asked me, "What exactly do you mean by a collective land title? Does that mean they can sell my farm?" And I think their concerns about losing control over their farms, along with the ongoing threats from armed groups in the region, have effectively silenced the Afro-Colombian Community Council's organizing efforts. It also led to my own departure from the Community Council after consulting with the leadership from the Community Council after about 8 months of living there. These threats continue today, as you can see in this threat I included on the slide, from so-called dissident guerrilla groups. And this was sent to various indigenous communities less than 2 weeks ago in northern Cauca. I really appreciate your time. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I look forward to Professor Ramírez's comments. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I think you've really done an amazing job at painting us a picture of the absolute human and ecological complexity at stake when we get down to specific places to look at the impacts of coca economies and the challenges of dealing with them. We'll now turn to María Clemencia Ramírez to hear your thoughts on the paper and on what the implications of Anthony's article might be for thinking through recommendations for the current situation on the ground.
Okay, I would like to begin my comments by giving some context to my research in Putumayo, where colono campesinos began to grow coca for the coca market promoted by narco-traffickers at the end of the 70s. By 2001, it was estimated that 78% of the department's population was involved in coca production, and Putumayo contained 54% of the area used for coca cultivation in Colombia by this 2000 year. On the other hand, guerrillas and paramilitaries were competing for territory there, for the power to regulate the coca market, and for the ability to collect illegal taxes. All of these circumstances combined to make an ideal scenario for Putumayo for the central mission Plan Colombia. Consequently, its implementation began in this department. Anthony's case study highlights and examines what has been called the balloon effect of coca cultivation, whereby as production decreases in one area, as occurred in Putumayo under Plan Colombia, whose central policy of aerial spraying was intensively implemented between 2000 and 2006, it bubbles up in other places, in this case in the northern region of Cauca, where, as a consequence of the repressive policies of the war on drugs, coca growers or colonos cocaleros from Putumayo began to arrive there in the mid-2000s. It took 2 decades of coca crops to fully arrive in the northern region of Cauca. Time and space are central to understanding how the coca economy affects territories and populations in different manners. Both northern Cauca and the lower Putumayo region are frontier regions where colonization processes have taken place but have developed in different ways. Colonos campesinos who arrived in Putumayo since the 50s had been displaced by partisan violence in the country's interior, among other things, and they saw the arrival of coca crops at the end of the 70s. During the coca booms of the 80s and 90s, these campesinos lived through the influx of narco-traffickers and colonos who came to the region specifically to cultivate coca, such as in the case of the campesinos depicted in La Ley del Monte, to whom Anthony makes reference in his article. Coca has been grown steadily in the Western Amazon for more than 20 years now, making Colombia the main producer of coca in the Andean region since 1997. The coca economy differs from other extractive boom economies such as rubber or oil production because it is a long-term agricultural crop that has allowed campesinos to invest in public goods such as education for their children. These campesinos identified as cocaleros and have given this identifier a new meaning, one that instead of being associated with criminality is linked with being campesinos who grow coca plants just as other campesinos cultivate coffee. That is why small coca growers created the National Coordinating Committee of Cultivators of Coca, Poppy, and Marijuana, COCAM, looking to be recognized as campesinos and not be criminalized, as well as to negotiate with the government and exert influence over the public policies that may affect them. They also have been willing to replace coca plants with other legal crops or to produce other consumer products that derive from coca leaf, such as coca cookies, coca toothpaste, soap, chewing gum, bread, sodas, wine, etc., as does the NASA indigenous group of the Resguardo Calderas de Enterradero Cauca or the Yanaconas in Huila. It is worth underscoring that historically campesinos have sought the support of state institutions and tried to follow the rule of law, even though they are criminalized because of the illegality ascribed to the coca plant. The COCAM is mentioned by Anthony at the end of the article when one of its representatives invites the Afro-Colombian and indigenous people attending the workshop organized by the Ethnic Commission to join the organization and is consequently pulled out of the meeting. This confrontation highlights the difference between ethnic and campesino communities regarding not only their viewpoints on the coca economy, but also around their rights. The Constitution of 1991 explicitly recognizes the pluriethnic and multicultural character of the Colombian nation, and consequently, first indigenous groups and afterwards Afro-Colombians with the Laws 70 of 1993 were given special rights that are not afforded to mestizo campesinos. Although those known as campesinos share no identifying ethnic identity, today they are demanding that the state recognize them as political subjects with special rights. They self-identify as a culturally diverse social and political group whose rights and survival must be defended. The idea of the anti-culture of coca clearly reflects the difference I have just mentioned, because it is articulated from a situated ethnic perspective where Afro-Colombian culture is no doubt a trait of identity, difference, and otherness, while colonos cocaleros are seen as lacking a differentiated culture. Thus, the term foráneos, or outsiders, given in Northern Cauca to the colonos cocaleros from an ethnocultural perspective, emphasizes their identity as newcomers from elsewhere. Anthony speaks of a new class of mestizos foráneos, who are evidence of the ongoing enclosure of Nuevo Amanecer and much of Northern Cauca, and also holds that the colono became an unwitting vanguard in the often violent process of rural enclosure. I have some questions for Anthony. Is this new class of mestizos foráneos homogeneous, or can we distinguish the presence of differentiated classes within it? Can we distinguish between a colono cocalero and a buyer or trafficker, even though both are considered foráneos? When you refer to drug traffickers as foráneos and benefactors, are you implying that small coca growers or colonos cocaleros are not subject to the control and violence as are the Afro-Colombian members of the community council? We are facing the contradictions and confrontation of recognized ethnic groups with campesinos mestizos, who with different political agendas are all struggling for multicultural recognition from the national state. On the one hand, Anthony signals how many Black and indigenous communities communities are demanding autonomy through legal recourse from the state on the basis of having received recognition as ethnic groups with special rights. On the other hand, campesino cocaleros are struggling to achieve cultural recognition in order to be part of the multicultural nation, and as such, secure their distinctive cultural and political rights according to their requirements. Anthony signals that colono cocaleros signed up to become members of the community council in order to benefit from the rights accorded to indigenous people and Afro-Colombians. It's worth mentioning that there are mestizo campesinos who are active participants in Nuevo Amanecer and are not considered foráneos. So here we have a very important issue going on between being part of the community council or just conform another organization. Anthony's analysis is marked by the ethnic and racial condition of the members of the Community Council of Nuevo Amanecer, to an extent that the PCN activist is quoted as considering Coca cultivation the revenge of the system, because it deepens capitalist relations, taken to be the opposite of their cultural and political struggles for autonomy and self-determination, and it reshapes the community racial formation. The issue of racialization becomes central in this region, which is not the case in the Western Amazon, where Black communities identified as campesinos fought hand in hand for decades with predominantly mestizo campesino colonos for their rights. Just recently, Black communities in Putumayo began to form community councils, while indigenous people had previously existed in resguardos. Taking these considerations into account, my final question to Anthony is the following. Are there possible common points to be found among indigenous Afro-Colombian and campesino cocaleros in order to promote intercultural relations and prevent further confrontation? This interaction can help unite campesinos, Afro-Colombians, and indigenous communities in their struggle to influence a reformulation of current drug policies and confront abusive narcotraffickers. That's it.
Thank you very much, María Clemencia. I think we will allow Anthony to respond to the comments of María Clemencia, but before we do, I think it would be great to maybe collect 2 or 3 comments and questions from the audience. So Anthony, you can take on those questions together with María Clemencia's questions to you. So I invite anyone who would like to raise their hand or write something in the chat to say that they would like to ask a question or make a comment. In the meantime, while you're all gathering your thoughts, I will abuse my position as chair and ask a question of my own, Anthony. I really appreciate the attention that María Clemencia is also asking you to pay to this complex interrelationship between multiculturalism and processes of multicultural recognition, and the entanglement of this with the Coca issue. And my question is perhaps a little bit provocative. Do you think that the struggle for cultural recognition has been replaced by a struggle for cocalero recognition? Make of that what you will. I have a question here now from Catherine Vizcaino. I don't know, Catherine, if you would like to turn on your camera and microphone and ask the question, or if you would prefer me to read it out. You're welcome to. Okay, I'm being asked to read it out. So she's asking if you could clarify, Anthony, just on the data table that you shared, were those figures of kilos of coca in production during those years, or of what? And also I have questions from Andre and Dara. So Andre, over to you.
Thanks, Anthony, and thank you, María Clemencia, for your comments. And I think I want to ask a question following a bit from what María Clemencia has just said towards the end of her comments. And is that, I'm also doing some research on coca economies and development in Nariño. And what we have seen in through some of the research that the National University has been doing is that the conflict over Cauca has also a deeper conflict about land, in which that involves the indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities and the campesinos. And because of that long dispute, it's very difficult to try to solve the issue of land through solving the issue of Cauca. So it seems that there are two parallel issues that need to be dealt with. And what I see that you are suggesting in Cauca is that sort of difficult structural problem in Colombia about land redistribution between these different sectors of the Colombian campesino people and Afro-Colombian communities is reproduced again, thanks to Cauca. So what would be your comment in terms of that? And then the second sort of question that I would like to ask you, and probably to hear also some comments from María Clemencia, if possible, is whether you mentioned it a bit, but I wonder whether you have some more information about how is it the relationship of the Afro-Colombian community councils and the new dissidents of the Farc? I mean, has that shifted? Did they have a different opinion of the previous Farc of the new second Marquetalia Farc? Do they think that they have become more criminalized, or they see them as the continuation of the same issue? I think that would be really important, because what we hear in the news is like the idea that this is just become a drug cartel and that they don't have legitimacy with the communities, and for that reason they are targeting the communities. And it would be very important to understand what is the perception of the communities, both in Putumayo and in Cauca, if possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre. Dara, over to you.
Hi, sorry, I just came from Microsoft Teams meeting, so I was looking in the wrong place for the unmute and put the video on. So, but Anthony, thank you very much. Really, really fascinating presentation. I really hope to get around to reading that article soon. I mean, I have got a few questions, and my sound was bad, so I didn't quite hear María Clemencia very well. So I know she might have covered some of this. Certainly at the end she did, about kind of colonials versus Afro and indigenous Colombians. So, I mean, I guess my first question would be: is it helpful to create a conflict, to set that up as a kind of irreconcilable conflict between peasants and Afro and indigenous communities? Moving on from that, I guess, and kind of building on some of the insights. I've done research in Montes de María, and certainly something that was mentioned there was a lot of the solidarity was broken down once. So the question is, to what extent has a kind of ethnic claims to recognition broken kind of bond of solidarity? While they're really important, there's also an element where, rather than kind of identifying and mobilizing kind of across groups, there's a tendency to kind of fragment into silos, and then there's always the danger of kind of divide and rule tactics, seeing that as well in the Serenade of Perijá as well. So to what extent has that happened? Again, this is a macro question, so I don't necessarily expect you to have the answer, because obviously you've done a kind of thing, but just like perhaps just in that specific region. And I guess another question is, I mean, it's a fascinating work. I guess the issue is the problem Cauca? Is the problem capitalism? Or is the problem military repression? You know, so for example, legalization of coca cultivation, does that help? Or does that just make it into an even more neoliberal economy, where if it's legal to cultivate, then obviously kind of there's even more incentives? Because of course, I would kind of push back strongly against the idea that that illicit economies are the only or even the principal driver of conflict, which I think you did deal with the land grabs for other reasons. I think in some of the work of Jacobo Grajales and others. So yeah, those three questions. I think there's another, but I didn't write it down, and therefore I forgot it. But if I'll try and come back to it if it occurs to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dara. And I think we'll hand back now to Anthony and María Clemencia, but perhaps I'll also ask María Clemencia a question, because before we began this talk, we were discussing your experience, María Clemencia, of writing your book on Putumayo, and the experience of having to produce this very quickly because of the policy environment in the US. And I wonder if you would have any, if you would be able to speak a little bit from your own experience to those of us working on Colombia and producing research. How can one use case studies such as the one that Anthony has done from the Cauca region? How can those case studies be useful in influencing policy discussions? So perhaps if you could also speak a little bit about that. Anthony, you've got a lot to attend to, so I'll let you answer in the order that you choose.
Just a few questions. But thank you. These are excellent questions, and many of them are related. I'll knock Catherine's question out first because it was about the empirical aspect of this, and they are hectares of coca in that chart, not kilos of cocaine. So those are hectares of coca, and the numbers that you're seeing change are how expansive these coca cultivations are, right? So let me think about how to respond to this, because I think there's a way in which a lot of the questions are picking up where Derek kind of started his comment and asking, is it helpful to create it as a conflict between the people in the Afro-Colombian Community Council and the foraños, right? And I think that is a really important question, and it's obviously one that I've struggled a lot. I mean, I've been a solidarity activist long before I was in the academy, right? I worked at WOLA prior to moving to Colombia, and then I was accompanying folks doing land recovery strategies in Urabá and in Tumaco. So, this is clearly a really important question to me. And my intent is not to be more divisive or just be divisive for the purpose of doing so. It also kind of presumes that this conflict doesn't already exist, right? And I think that's the really important thing for me to focus on. The reason I asked this question, and it is a thorny, difficult question, because it brings in all these conversations of multiculturalism, of the state, of capital, of now what do you do with drug trafficking? What does the Farc mean in this question, right? Like this, through this one little insight, you can see all of this expand out, right? But I think what's important to mention is that the conflict was already there before I got there. Right. And it's not just in Cauca. I work with folks in, for example, the Consejo Comunitario de Altamira in Nariño on the border with Ecuador, and they're confronting the same issues. Right. And that's where Genaro Garcia was murdered at the tail end of the peace process. And so we're seeing how this is going on, right? How these clashes between, outside coca growers are affecting autonomous struggles by Black and Indigenous communities throughout much of the Pacific coast. Right. The problem is how do we talk about this, right? And what does it mean? Are we just falling for like the simple identity trap of saying, it's clearly these mestizo colonos cocaleros are entering into conflict with the Black Community Council? And what I'm trying to be very careful with, and I appreciate Professor Ramírez's comments on it, is saying that, well, not even everybody in the Community Council that's accepted as being part of the Community Council is Black, right? There's a way of, and this is what I tried to get at the beginning of the talk, was how are we talking about these categories, right? Because there's one level of this that's the formal organizations, right? And then there's the other level of it, which I try to get to in the article a bit more, and that's how do people experience these categories and navigate them on their own in relationship with, in opposition to, or just jutting against these categories that sometimes get imposed from above, or sometimes they embrace as, a way of making a political demand, as a Black political subject, as an indigenous political subject, and now as a campesino political subject, right? But I've spent a lot of time thinking about multiculturalism, and I tend to agree that official forms of neoliberal multiculturalism are a major part of the problem, because they create categories that kind of channel the different kinds of political demands that can emerge from these complicated scenarios, right? And so they create categories that then people can latch onto and try to work with. And it divides often more than it provides a space for making collective demands. But within that, what I think is really important is to understand the diversity of political demands that emerge from these very complicated situations. And when we're talking about something like coca or drug trafficking, especially in Northern Cauca, and I would guess in other parts, especially that I'm familiar with, the Farc has played a really important role in trying to have complete monopoly on what the demands coming out of these zones look like, right? And, you know, I think the COCAM in a lot of ways has come into that space that was left behind by the Farc and tried to make demands based on a very peasant-oriented approach to development and land use that is very different from Black and indigenous demands, at least in Northern Cauca, which talk about autonomy, right? I write about this a bit in my book manuscript, but there's a way in which the peasant logic is la tierra es para quien la trabaja, right? The land belongs to the people that work it, right? That does not necessarily jive with the worldview of the folks that I work with. You don't have to work land to exploit the land in order to live on it, right? Or to have a right to be on it, right? And so what we're seeing here are different political articulations. And this is the kind of stuff that doesn't often emerge when we talk about the colonos cocaleros, right? And to respond directly to Professor Ramírez's remarks about, you know, are there just different classes of colonos cocaleros? Of course there are. I'm not saying that every colono cocalero is, you know, a bigwig drug trafficker. Far from it, right? And I cited one person who was a colono, was a forano, and ended up becoming part of the community council. I mean, these people go to dances together, they go to cockfights together, and at times, you know, these relationships become very fraught, especially when people stand up for themselves, right? So I have several friends who have received death threats for standing up to the colonos cocaleros and the agenda that they're pushing on these communities, or these community meetings that I described, right? I have friends who have survived assassination attempts and that continue to do really important work in spite of the threats against them, others that have been displaced to other parts of the country. And so when we start talking about this relationship between coca, which I think is better probably to talk about cocaine, capitalism, and military repression, I find them to be inextricable, right? And that quote, I think that Professor Ramírez brought up about being the unwitting vanguard of capitalism, for me is pretty important, because the relationships, the social relations do change with the arrival of coca, because this coca is not being cultivated for some sort of traditional use. What you see is large-scale coca monocultures that are used for the production of cocaine, right? And that does deepen capitalist relations. People have more cash, right? In the article, I talk about how people start getting paid on credit. You know, we're talking about communities that were primarily subsistence communities prior to the arrival of coca. Not entirely, right? I'm not trying to paint with broad strokes. There's nuance to it, but more so than there was after the arrival of coca. I feel like I'm talking too much, but I could go on. Yeah, and if I miss something, and then just one other to wrap up, the conversation about legalization, right? And I kind of knew that this would be coming. I think legalization has to be on the table as any part of resolving the issue of coca, right? It is not a silver bullet though, because as you see, and as you mentioned, you know, capital continues to function the same way. Extractive industries are legal in many places, but they still exploit the people that work in them or that live in those territories. So you can't just think because legalization passes, if it does at some moment, that things will be resolved. But I don't think that you can talk about resolving this problem as long as cocaine is illegal, or as long as it is in the way it is right now.
Thank you, Anthony. María Clemencia.
Yes, I would like to think about the difficulties of precisely in the meeting that you were talking now, Amanecer, the foreigners were behind. They became part of the committee, but they didn't go, so they were obstaculizing the agenda of the Afro-Colombian. But that's why it's a perversive result and unintended consequence of the multicultural recognition. So northern of Cauca, it becomes like a very important laboratory of looking at this complexity within this recognition that was very well received. And something that I would really stress about these cases that we have been looking at for 25 years. That is something that I would like to stress, the long-term structure of Coca cultivation and how it is also changing the way as you were experiencing in northern Cauca. You say, here they come, and why did they get there? Because they were, the aerial spraying was a lot. And what are we, and what is the government proposing now? Aerial spraying. It's like after 25 years of war on drugs, of Plan Colombia, of all what we have been going through of militarization, we continue doing the same policy, the same way to deal with the war on drugs. So one of the things that I am really looking at, and I'm seeing that is beginning to make a space, is not legalization necessarily. It's the transformation of the coca leaf in different products that are not cocaine. So we have to be very, and I saw, for example, Transnational Institute. Now in Colombia, you are beginning to hear talk about, because of the marijuana that has been recognized legally, and the idea of have marijuana is helpful in the medical scene, etc. That is happening also with the coca leaf. It's beginning to happen, and I think that is a very important trend of policy that maybe after 25 years, I remember 5 years before hearing from the Minister of Interior saying that, the Vice Minister of Interior saying that we couldn't talk about coca leaf. That was prohibited. It's like something we couldn't really, and now we're beginning to hear this possibility. So there are trends of policy that goes maybe not to legalize the thinking about cocaine or thinking like alcohol or like this type of thing, but to use the coca, because the coca crops are very adaptable. They grow, they don't even if you have a hectare of coca, you don't need to continue expanding, and deforestation is not the product of coca crops necessarily, because you can have an hectare of coca and you don't need to continue deforestation. So there are a lot of good things about the coca as a plant. And these colono cocaleros, as you are saying, they come to that region and they come with the idea of narco trafficking. That's true. They are not. I was in a meeting in 2004 with indigenous people from Peru, Bolivia, and of the Macizo, colonos of the Macizo, and they were talking about the sacred plant and everything, and Colombians even linked with that narrative. What what does coca leaf means to them? It means a better way of life. It means educating their children. You also have said that. It's something that is like giving them a little bit more of a possibility of investing in other goods that not necessarily only survive. That is the idea of the government. You have to survive with whatever you have and you don't need anywhere else. No, it's like they don't recognize the needs of the. So there, I would think that also on the one hand, these new ways of looking at possibilities of substitution, of doing other type of things that not necessarily are the alternative crops that we have to because alternative crops have been promoted during the Plan Colombia tour in Putumayo, and a lot of the things didn't work out. So you have to also recognize that the coca gives the peasants money every 3 months. It's like a fluid way of receiving money. It's something that is very important. And then the other proposals there has not been like a really political will to sit down and look at what is the rationality of the cultivation of the economy, the political economy of the coca, without demonizing the coca, without satanizing, like this criminalizing of the coca leaf. And so this discussion is beginning. Well, there's a project, a proposal in the Congress of Feliciano Valencia and Iván Marulanda looking to, and the indigenous people are beginning to demand the recognition of the products of the coca leaf. So we have like a space that is beginning to open. And regarding the multicultural recognition, the COCAN, although it has been the emergence of this organization is promoted by the Farc, and it was promoted since the negotiation of El Caguán, when in the Caguán, when Pastrana did all his process in the Caguán, they had this international meeting, and the Farc, and there's also this idea that the Farc. There's another thing that is very pervasive for me, that is the government recognizes the authority of the Farc in the regions. When they decided to do the pennies in 2017 with the Farc, they really were recognizing they had an authority and expecting that because the Farc was leading the substitution program of pennies, the peasants will do it. So we have this acceptance during decades that those territories were given to the Farc. This is obvious. You can look at the reverse of the nation that post Margarita Serge. This is also, it's been in the open. You know, those areas they didn't, now are areas that they want to explode because of the resources of the Altillanura and all the land grabs that we're seeing. So what I don't know if I'm not very very logic, but my idea is to look at the years of changing, of how it changes and changes, and how there's moments that we can help to influence the public policy around coca. And that's the question that you were asking me about the case studies and the policy influence through these case studies. I had always thought that comparing regions is so important because every region has elements of the same. For example, when I was doing my research in Putumayo and Mauricio Romero was doing his research in Córdoba, and we had the same paramilitary, Farc, the same in the 90s, in the 2000s, but they were developing in very different ways. The same problems developed in different ways. So only comparing and being able to have regionality into account for the policies that are, and that's something that the government is not interested in. I haven't seen the will to look at the complexity. What Anton was saying, it's very complex. It's not only the narco-trafficker, but also the small colono cocalero, but also we have the land grabber, and where does that happen? Because it's not all over the place. There are certain places that are really focused on that topic of the land. Or Nariño. Nariño is a very different situation. But Nariño comes also because all in 2000, with Plan Colombia, Llorente begins. It's called the small Putumayo. So you see the movement of coca all over the place because it's a good, it's a good business, and illegality is helping. That's true. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, María Clemencia. We have two more questions. And I think if anyone else would like to ask a question, please do write something and draw my attention to it, because I think this will be the last round. We have a question, first of all, from Herman, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Anthony, for a fascinating presentation. Great article. It's really interesting. Thank you, María Clemencia, for the great comments as well. My question is for Anthony, and it has to do with the 2016 peace agreement, the current government, and the provisions of the 2016 peace agreement on coca crop substitution and drug trade in general. So, at least in paper, there are very transformative provisions in the 2016 peace agreement regarding land reform and coca crop substitution. Which includes, you mentioned this in your presentation, also at the beginning of your article, with the comprehensive national plan for crop substitution, or the PENIS for its very unfortunate Spanish acronyms. So these provisions sound transformative in paper in the agreement, but what are your thoughts about these provisions regarding coca crops and rural land reform? Are they enough to solve the problem that you mentioned? At least part of it. Of course, we have a government that does not want to implement the agreement, and particularly those provisions regarding rural land reform, which are very much connected to coca crop substitution. And this government embraces a hardline approach, as María Clemencia was saying, that relies heavily on forced eradication and aerial fumigation of crops, which we, as María Clemencia also mentioned, we know that this doesn't work. This approach does not work, and it has been tested for more than 20 years. It has been implemented for more than 20 years, and we know that it doesn't work. But we have a government that doesn't want to implement the provisions of the 2016 peace agreement, and that is trying again a failed approach to it. So I'm curious about your thoughts about this 2016 peace agreement and the implementation of it.
Thank you, Herman. And then we have a question from Tatiana, who's asking me to read the question aloud. And it's a question for Anthony. And she says, you were talking about indigenous, campesino, and Afro-Colombian identities or cultural categories, and the different ways in which they articulate their demands as political subjects. In your opinion, have the Farc ex-combatants in Cauca and Nariño, who are now under a process of reincorporation, have they emerged as a new identifiable, distinct social or cultural category, or do they identify themselves as any of the above? And where do they stand in local coca-related dynamics? I think that's a really important question. And I will add one more question to both of you before we return to your final remarks. Given that you're both not only experts on Colombia, but also both of you have a lot of knowledge about the policy world in the US, which of course plays a very major role in defining the drug policy of Colombia. I wonder what your thoughts are about the potential for a window of opportunity to influence things positively under the arrival of Joe Biden as president. I think there have been a lot of people who have said hopeful things about the possibility of Joe Biden denarcotization of the relations between the US and Colombia, and at least an openness to thinking about tackling the Coca issue with a more comprehensive perspective, drawing on some of the comprehensive measures agreed, as Germán mentioned, by the 2016 Peace Accord, not only in point 4, but also across the board. And if you do think that that's a window of opportunity, what would be the key message that you would lobby in a kind of American policy space, using the privilege of academia and the sort of the independence of voice of academia? What would be your main invitation to policymakers in the US to focus on with regards to this issue? So perhaps we'll allow María Clemencia to respond first, and then allow Anthony to make final remarks. María Clemencia.
Okay, regarding the policy in the United States, I heard Adam Isaacson-Owola stating in one meeting that is the Colombian, the embassy in Colombia, that is looking forward to lobby for militarization, aerospace. It has been like that since I remember, since the 1996. And there are other, they are looking to give aid for substitution, and it's our government, and it's something that I really want to stress, because when I was working, I had some experience going to the Department of State and do some research there, and they told me, I remember telling, oh, we were spraying. I'm talking about 2000. I'm not talking about 2020. And I was saying, oh, we were spraying. It's terrible, and it's all because of the United States. And they told me, no, your government. Have you seen aerospraying in Bolivia or in Peru? They don't let us spray there. Your government is the one that is spraying. So there are nuances, as Anthony said. It's not just the United States and the policy of the war on drugs. It's also the governments that have the ability or not to look for further or different things to do. And because of the criminalization of coca growers, we haven't been able to deal with other type of policies. And I think that the Biden administration, there has been a support from the Barack Obama administration to the peace agreements. And the peace agreements are related to substitution of crops in the number 4 and the number 1 point of the accord. So I think we would expect that they are going to support the implementation of the peace accords. So that's why all the peasants in Colombia and people in Cauca areas are demanding the implementation of the peace accords. It has become like the main demand, because implementing the peace accords means an integral, a comprehensive peace accord that has a lot of aspects in the rural areas about the conflict. So I hope that they will have to change a little bit but it's more our government than the United States. And another thing I forgot to answer was about the Dissidents now in Putumayo, and if they are, how they are seen. They are not really seen as there's not a continuation of the Dissidents, as the people are not receiving them in the same manner as it were the Farc, because that's another thing that has changed. That's another thing that has a long term of presence in the region. And Carolina, the Frente Primero of Duarte that has in the south, has in Puerto Guzmán in the north of Putumayo, has come there, and there have been a lot of deaths and assassinations of local leaders recently, and very related to the incident in that area of Puerto Guzmán. So it's a very, I think, the narrative of the Frente Primero is the same, as if there has not changed anything. Here we come, we're fighting for the people. They don't recognize the differences that there are also ethnic communities that don't want them to be there. There's not any recognition about that. So it's really very, very different. I think people are not relating to them in the same way as if they were the Farc. And not even when they were demobilized. Years before their demobilization, there was a very strong change among how the people perceive the Farc. So that is something I would like to thank you.
Thank you, María Clemencia. Anthony, over to you to answer the final questions and make any closing remarks you'd like to make.
Great. Well, thanks. Another amazing group of questions. And I'd like to start where María Clemencia left the last round of comments, and it ties into the chapter 4. And I guess you were talking about substitution as a possibility. And I think that, that needs to be supported, and we need to think hard about what that looks like. But I think sometimes that becomes shorthand for just another kind of exploitation, right? And so I think the using, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but I feel like sometimes the way that substitution is framed, especially from the government, is like, well, now instead of coca, you're going to grow cacao, but your relationship with the padrón is going to be the same. You're still not going to make any money. You're still not going to get any technical support, and you're still not going to have roads to take it to market. And, on and on and on. It's the same story as always. So what kind of system are we dealing with when we talk about substitution? For me, is a really big and important question that we need to focus on, right? Because I am very aware, after meeting with the state in both the United States and in Colombia, that they can turn something that sounds really nice, just like it happened with multiculturalism, and turn it to its opposite, right? And use that as another way to drive a wedge in communities, to lock people into certain social relations that exploit them, right? And that was one of my main concerns with chapter 4 of the peace accords, right? I obviously applaud any effort to build peace, right? I think that's really important. But we have to think about what was being negotiated there. What were the perspectives that came to light and came to dominate chapter 4 of the peace accords, right? And we can think of the state on one side and the Farc on the other as the principal negotiators of these peace accords. And what emerges from the accords as a whole is a very campesinista view of what Colombia can look like. And that is not necessarily antagonistic to capital, right? And I was part of the ethnic commission, basically, accompanying them from the beginning. We went to Havana in 2016 in like June, and then we were in Palacio de Nariño. And why was the ethnic commission even a thing? Why did that have to exist? Well, it exists because the perspective of Black and Indigenous communities was systematically excluded from the peace process during the 4 years of negotiation, right? And that's not just a nominal inclusion-exclusion here. We're talking about a whole worldview that's being excluded. I mean, when there's the differences between the campesinos version of what la tierra para quien la trabaja is and what a Black or Indigenous community might be arguing for, right? That leaves a lot out. And another problem with chapter 4 was that it's still, it voiced this idea of community-based participation, right? And that's maybe the most exciting part about it, right? That the communities determine the PISDA, right? They determine what the municipality does, and then that determines what the regional Coca plan is, and that determines what the national plan is. It's supposed to be from the bottom up. In practice, this has been a total catastrophe, right? We've seen people who have volunteered to substitute only to not have anything come by way of support from the state. And this was totally, expected. And that for me is the major problem, right? So for me, it's how do we frame the state? I think too often we're thinking about the state as a benefactor, right? Somebody who is going to come in benevolently and help resolve the problems that people are facing, the very real ones. And this gets back to the issue of substitution that I'm concerned with, because how do you even deal with coca legally right now when you're at gunpoint to do it for another rationale, another locus? It just doesn't seem feasible to me to talk about substitution without talking about legalization, because the pressure on communities is so immense, right? You feel it when you're there. You can sense it, right? You can tell by the way that leaders talk or do not talk about how they're confronting drug trafficking, right? And so I think, while Chapter 4 creates an impressive array of opportunities, and I mean, I feel like I was so lucky to be in Cauca between 2016 and 2017, when there was like a honeymoon period and we could travel and talk to folks, but that quickly disappeared, right? Like that disappeared right around March, April, when we started to see these new groups pop in. And, it ultimately led to me having to leave the place where I was living, but much worse off for the folks that stuck around, right? Or that couldn't stick around and had to leave at gunpoint, right? So I guess that's just what I'd signal with Chapter 4 there. I mean, it was an amazing way to dialogue with people. It was inspirational. It seemed like things could be changing, right? And, after the plebiscite, you started to notice that this was just more of the same from the state, right? Things were not going to be the way they could be, right? That other world that was possible through the peace accords quickly started to vanish off into the horizon. And, so when we talk about the Farc ex-combatants, to respond to Tatiana's question, which I think is really good too, is I guess the Farc ex-combatants that I'm familiar with and some of whom I've befriended over the years, like, it's not a monolith. Some folks are part of the party. Some folks don't feel identified with the party at all, but are doing their own kind of community-based activism, which is really exciting and interesting to hear. It's something that we don't often hear a lot about. And other folks, disappeared into the ether, and they went back to where they were from, or maybe they joined an armed group. It was hard to keep track of what was going on. But I remember going to the reintegration camp in Buenos Aires with Congressman Jim McGovern from the United States Congress and the director of WOLA back in, I guess it was August of 2017. And we're talking no more than a year after the peace accords were signed, and that place was empty. There wasn't a soul there, right? There wasn't really even a military presence to speak of. When we passed a checkpoint that was supposed to be protecting them, right next to that military checkpoint, I wish I had my camera, there was a hill where people were just harvesting coca, right? And so all the contradictions were in plain view. But what does that mean for me? Like, it means that, in terms of the Farc at least, it's a diverse group of people. A lot of people had different motivations for being there, and they took the post-conflict moment in very different directions. And I mean, one thing that I would like to see more highlighted is the work of folks that are committed to social change, but maybe not necessarily involved with the party, because the party's kind of confronting a crisis right now. And what does that mean? What kind of space do they have politically to discuss these issues, right? I don't know. I think that's fairly interesting. And in terms of Gwen's question, I guess before I move on to that, I think something that María Clemencia is bringing up that's really important is when she's talking about this experience of seeing what these groups do in different regions, she's helping us understand that there's a difference between what people say their political motivations are and what their political practices are, right? So there's a lot of groups and analysts in Bogota and in the US that talk about, there's this many fronts, there's this many soldiers, this many weapons, this many tons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like three-dimensional chess where, we're trying to piece together what this conflict looks like by looking at the armed actors in it. But I would push us to think beyond this logic of war, right? This is not helping us think through what is desperately needed, right? And that's to make space for more of these bottom-up ideas for people who are affected by these issues to be empowered by this process and determine their own futures for themselves, right? And that's a very different logic from saying, these actors have this control over this territory, because as we've discussed today, it's so much more messy than that, right? And the dreams of a lot of these folks and the aspirations of a lot of these folks exceed what even Chapter 4 of the Peace Accords or Chapter 1 or what the state could ever offer. So what do we do with that, right? And then I'll get to Gwen's answer. And from the US, I mean, I think our responsibility is to support what social movements on the ground are saying and doing. And where that's most effective is stopping repressive strategies by the state to either eradicate forcibly, stopping fumigations if they were to ever come on the agenda again, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the points that María Clemencia brings up here are also key, right? It means confronting, the Colombian embassy in Washington, D.C., which has been a major thorn in the side of anybody who's done any activism trying to change U.S. foreign policy towards Colombia. Yes. But again, we have to change the logic here, right? And I think with Biden in power, I'm not all that optimistic. I mean, he's one of the architects of Plan Colombia. I think there will be a little bit more space to wiggle around and put pressure in terms of human rights. He's not going to be openly hostile as this person in the White House right now is. But, I think that there's going to be space, but I also don't think that we can look at this as like a paradigm shift, because he comes from the establishment that pushed the drug war and the war on terror for decades. And what we need now is a fresh take, because what we've got has absolutely not worked, right? So I'll leave it there, but thank you.
Anthony, I said I was going to wrap it up there, but we've got, obviously this is a really fascinating discussion, and I have two more questions. If you don't mind giving the chance to these people to respond, because I think it's product of how interesting this discussion has been. I have a question from Catherine, who's saying that she's not sure if this is going to come across in a PC way. So she's asking me to try to word it in a PC way, but I'm not sure I managed that either. But I'm going to say what she's written is the following. Most people recognize that the exploitative controls of the major landowners like Uribe are expressed in the paramilitary guerrilla ideological warfare. Well, so a lot of this is underlaid by the landowning elites. How realistic is it to detail agriculture swaps, substitutions, or actual implementation of the peace process when these are not in the interests of the ruling classes, whether we're looking either at Duque and his allies or realistic problems on the ground and those resolutions? I think this is a question that is very much speaking back to what you were just saying. And she's saying, unless there are much deeper changes in the government, education and policy, what can realistically happen, especially given the mix of religious conservatism, neoliberalism, and plain demand for cocaine on the global market not changing? So that's Catherine's question. And Andre also wrote to me saying he wanted to disagree with something that you were saying. So Andre, I will allow you to ask your question, and then we'll wrap up after that.
No, thanks so much, Gwen. No, I just think that these spaces are so valuable because we get the chance to put forward our ideas and try to engage in a proper dialogue and discussion, and just not trying to cut it short. And now when I listen to Anthony, the last response that he was giving, I just felt that I wanted to come back with some points. And I'm sure that here there are people who know these points better than I do. And it's for the sake of critical engagement on these issues. So I think first you said, sometimes when we talk about the state, we see it as a benefactor. Yeah, but the opposite of doing that is to see the state as an evil force, as the demon that wants to do the total opposite, and not as a very complex actor, as Gwen calls it, a complex ecosystem where there are different forces, in tension most of the time. And I think that's something that we really need to recognize, because I think that when we think about the negotiations between Santos and the Farc, there was a complex set of different actors engaged in negotiations. So just to put the focus on the Farc negotiation team and on the government negotiation team is a huge mistake. For one reason, because there were lots of different ways of doing advocacy in order to put points in the agenda. So that's the first thing that I would say. Now, in terms of the second thing, I think I'll be more cautious in what you said, that the ethnic communities were constantly sidelined by the negotiations. For one reason, in every one of the points of the agreement, the Farc and the government organized these national forums, and they opened the space for different grassroots organizations to participate. And as far as I know, many of those leaders were Afro-Colombian leaders. They were going and joining the forums, and they were presenting proposals to be taken to Havana. Of course, they were not restricted to the ethnic focus as such, but they were participating in the roundtables in order to submit the proposals to Havana. And this was a very complex thing for the negotiation teams, because the negotiation teams were receiving proposals that had an ethnic dimension, and they were tabulating them and putting them in different ways. So they felt that when they were creating the PEDETs, for example, they were taking into account one of the needs of the Afro-Colombian proposals put in some of the roundtables. So of course, there is a difference between that and coming as an ethnic minority and saying, this is my face, and I want to have my face in the picture of the negotiations. And they put so much pressure, as you rightly said, that toward the end of the negotiations, in the last minute, the government and the Farc finally open up and say, let's take the picture, and say that just like gender groups came here, just like victims groups came here, also the ethnic communities came here. And this is the face of this. And I think that's fine, but I think we need to understand this complexity. And the final thing that I wanted to say is that, you know, I think I'll also be a bit more cautious in the way how you talk about how once the implementation started, we could see that, you know, this was not gonna happen. The transformations and the dreams of the people, you know, were not going to become a reality because there was somehow an evil state behind this. And is that, you know, I think there was a window of opportunity. Santos, and we discussed here in our first seminar, had a very serious problem because he was trying to make deals with different sectors of the Colombian establishment, the land ruling elites who have particular interest, and he was trapped within that. And he was trying also to do other things to try to keep sort of a balance to be able to govern the country. And that meant, you know, tough trade-offs. But there was a window of opportunity. And what he was trying to do was to say, well, there is a social agenda here for the social movements. Or no, but the reality was that the civil society was taking this agenda forward. And there was one thing that was absolutely needed for this not to fall up into pieces. And it was that there needed to be a government of transition. And that government of transition needed to be in 2018. And that was a huge problem because that's what really has derailed the whole thing. Because Santos could not guarantee that the space that had been open was going to continue into the next years. But what you needed there was someone with political will to allow the seeds of peace that were not perfect, that had very serious problems because the economic model was never negotiated, but those things to start unleashing the structural transformations that were embedded in small things like the PEDETs that now are created, but they are not really pushed forward in the transformation that was expected in the territories. And now the PENIS has been dismantled. So I just wanted to air those sort of things, and sorry if it took too long, but thank you so much for your comments.
Thanks, Andre. And perhaps just seeing as you mentioned my concept of the government as a dynamic ecosystem, perhaps I'll just add to this by saying that one of the reasons that I found when I was doing my research on the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace and the institutional ethnography of the Santos administration, I was very struck by the fact that the Agencia para la Renovación del Territorio, which was making territorial visits in the beginning of the implementation phase, and the funcionarios of the PENIS were going to the same places and talking to the same communities, but not talking to each other. And this, of course, the point 4 and point 1 of the agreement were absolutely connected. You can't have crop substitution unless you're going to engage in the comprehensive rural reform to enable a more, a more modern, as some people see it, countryside. And this is partly due to the fact that the directors of the institutions would not talk to each other. And so when you start teasing apart the government as a social world, you find all of these institutions are made up of human beings who have personalities and who have problems in getting along with each other. And this also goes back to the fact that the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace and the what was then created as the Presidential Advisory Position on Post-Conflict, which was supposed to prepare for implementation back in 2014, they couldn't get on with each other either. So a lot of these things were not aligned with each other, not necessarily because of any lack of overarching political will, but because the individuals in charge of these different aspects of implementation couldn't find a way to work together. And so I think one of the ways in which we have to try to deal with this is to develop a more nuanced analysis also of the structures of power that are in charge of dealing with this in order to be able to put pressure on them in a more precise way. But that's the subject of another talk. Anthony, do you want to come back to Andre and respond to Catherine, and then we really will close?
No, these are great questions, and I love this kind of debate, and it's sorely missing, you know, and it's telling that we can't always have these kinds of conversations because of the conditions of violence in a lot of spaces, right? There's probably a while where I wouldn't dare to talk about these things in some spaces, and I really appreciate the space that y'all are opening up here. Where to start? So in terms of Catherine's question, I always tend to clam up when we talk about realistic possibilities, because I feel like this is a realm of political contestation, and we make the possibilities by putting them out there. There's always things that never seemed impossible that become attainable. And I think that's a beautiful part about working with several of these vibrant social movements from all stripes in Southwestern Colombia and on the Pacific, right? And, you know, I feel like, you know, the space that Gwen and I shared in Urabá is an example of that. You know, who would have thought that, you know, less than 10 years after El Alemán took over Urabá, that people would go and reclaim the land that they had that was now covered by oil palm, right? And that they'd still be living there right now. And that's inspiring, it's heartening, but it also talks about how folks create possibilities. And I think that's another reason why talking about peace is so important. You know, I know I can sound like overly pessimistic and demonizing or something like that, but this opens up a really important space, but it doesn't cease to be a space of political contestation. So when we talk about peace, I really want us to think about what do we mean by it, because it can be a feel-good word, and it can end up in the terms of the people who express goodwill, but maybe, you know, that doesn't mean all that much for folks that continue to confront violence, right? And I completely understand, you know, the idea that, you know, there are maybe like good people that work for the state, or that not everything is terrible. But what I want to push us to think about, what is the logic that governs statecraft in Colombia, historically and contemporarily, right? And is there a logic? And if that's so, what is it? And how do we understand the people that live in Northern Cauca's relationship to the state? What has that consisted of until now? And what does it look like when the bureaucrat from Bogota comes to whatever municipality of Suarez, or in Northern Cauca, from Corinto to Suarez, and has an attitude of how they think things need to go, and listens to people, might hear what they have to say, might even include it in the relatoria or the minutes from the meeting. But what does that translate to, you know? And I guess what I'm trying to voice is a frustration with that kind of a process, right? And so when you're asking me, that they're saying that the Black and Indigenous folks from the Comisión Étnica and Sen Paz and all that wanted to be a face in a picture, I feel like it was more than just a face in a picture that people wanted. They wanted meaningful representation. They wanted meaningful participation, not just heeding the call to participate in another meeting in another conference room, right? And I don't think that we've done a good enough job of understanding what does it mean to have meaningful participation, right? And what does that look like? because we might be using the same words, but I don't know if we're all, and I'm not just saying between you and I, but Andre, but in general, like more broadly, what are we talking about when we talk about meaningful participation? What does justice or peace look like to someone in Northern Cauca versus somebody in Bogota, or somebody in Washington, D.C. or South Carolina? So I guess that for me is really important. And, you know, cracking the logic of the state and how it expresses itself, especially in these parts of the country that we've talked about today, be it Putumayo, Nariño, Cauca, whatever, like there's a long way to go to figure out what a better outcome might look like. But I have a hunch that the people that are in the day-to-day struggle of trying to make a better life for themselves have some really good ideas about what could work for them. And those spaces have yet to claim the prominence that they deserve.
Thank you, Anthony. María Clemencia, would you like to make any final remarks on this topic?
Yes, I would like to support the idea of how we open the spaces for those people to really tell what they need, what they have done proposals, but they're not heard. And one of the things I would like to point out is that in Chile, with the PDEs, what he did is to contract a firm here in Boston that's called Deloitte, in order for them to do all the program. And so he presents that as a big thing. Deloitte is gonna tell us what we have to do in Catatumbo. I couldn't believe the amount of money they're paying these people to do the planification. They go to Catatumbo, they began to do all the roads and what you hear is always, we need to be heard. We have other proposals. Okay, the roads are very important, but this has been going on forever. The recognition of the areas, the peripheral areas in Colombia, people are subestimados. They talked about them. They don't know what they want. They don't even know the region because they come from other parts of the. They're not raizales. They're not native. They don't know. It's a total. They're analphabet or whatever. So if we were able, I think that was one of the main, and I'm totally in support of what Anthony is saying. We need to open the people. What does that mean? Meaningful participation. That's what they want. That's very true.
Thank you, María Clemencia. And Andre is asking you if you could maybe write in the chat what the name of the consultancy is, so we can look it up, because I think it would be worth us to know. And we also have a comment here from Dudley. Thank you, Dudley. And he says, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I know the government sought to make the peace process as bottom up as possible, as well as top down, but it seems we did not succeed. Dudley, I don't know if you would like to make your comment in person. You'd be very welcome to before I close, if you want to turn your camera on. No. Okay. Oh, yeah, here we are. Hi, Dudley. Do you want to maybe explain who you are?
Very quickly. Just thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. And I've downloaded Anthony's article to read. Maybe it does sound very good. No, I'm aware that we had hours and hours of discussion. I was one of the team advising Santos during the process, and how to reach out to the base communities, how to ensure that particularly victims, but also those who are going to be affected by the peace process, could be involved and have their voice heard. And people went to Havana, there were discussion groups, there were fora. We attempted to set up lots of mechanisms for this. Unfortunately, from what you say, and also from much other evidence, this didn't turn out as we had hoped, or at least not to the extent that we'd hoped. The idea was to have territorial peace, not just disarmament. And what does territorial peace mean? It means that the state adopts a presence in the hinterland of Colombia, in La Colombia Profunda, which is benevolent and not malevolent. And of course, like any state, it's subject to pressure groups from above, from below, from the side, and of course the rural elites have a voice as well. But that was the concept, that was the theory. And I'm afraid, as Gwen indicated, in the months following the peace process, and indeed until today, that has not been implemented, that the state has not taken over the areas abandoned by the Farc. The state has not brought the benevolent institutions of the state, because there are benevolent institutions of any state as well as not so benevolent. And they failed, it seems to me, in areas of security, infrastructure, education, and health, all of which were very much on the agenda for this is what we were going to deliver. And it's really quite sobering to hear how far short we've fallen on this. But thank you very much again for such an interesting discussion.
Thank you, Dudley. And I think we must have you as a presenter in one of these seminars soon as well, to hear your side of the story, because I think you're absolutely, it's important to point out the effort that was put into trying to make the state listen. And I think that this whole discussion really, and I'm sort of going to wrap up now before we say goodbye, but I think this whole discussion has really kind of raised the question of what does it mean for the state to listen? And what does it mean for the state not just to listen as human beings, but also for the human beings who represent the state to listen, and then actually to deliver change in a way that is not just tick boxing, what I used to call, when I was doing my field work in Colombia, Anthony, thinking about all of those events that you describe, the refrigerización de la participación, when participation becomes the transformation of just delivering empanadas and jugo de mora and like a checklist where people sign their name and say, yeah, yo participé. But how does actually participation deliver the overarching objective of participation, which is a transformation of social and political relations based on the vision of communities, rather than just saying, oh, the communities want a bridge here and some water here, but actually a much more holistic thing. And I think that and Dudley's point really raises the issue that it's not so easy to do. Even if you have the best of intentions in the state institutions, where there is power, where there is money, where there is policy control, it's not easy to create a system whereby that actually happens. And I think that remains to be an area of discussion which is very important. But I think that discussion was easier to have under a government which had political will to at least engage in that discussion. I think the problems now are slightly different. But I think that I would like to conclude by saying that I really think this discussion has been fantastic, and I'm really grateful, again, as an anthropologist, to have heard from Anthony, María, Clemencia, because I think this discussion really shows how detailed, localized ethnographic studies can shed light on the complexity of coca growing and how it really touches every single level of social relations. And I think, Anthony, you said it really clearly. Coca changes social relations. Why? Because capital changes social relations. And María Clemencia also said it really clearly. A solution to coca needs to go through social relations in order for, and through capital and relations of capital, in order for sort of a transformation to in a positive direction to take place. And I think that, as María Clemencia said, the first thing necessary for that to happen is a political will to examine the political economy of coca without criminalizing. And I think that is a space that as academics we can fight for, lobby for, recommend, building on this kind of level of complexity of engagement in the social and cultural relations, and in the identity issues also that surround this case study. And I think that we will all be very excited to read Anthony's book when it comes out, which no doubt will give us some more meat to chew on about what the kind of local view of peace looks like from Nuevo Amanecer and surrounding areas where you've done research. So thank you both very much, Anthony and María Clemencia, for accompanying us in this discussion. Thank you for your time, and thank you everybody for coming and engaging in this conversation this evening. I think this is precisely what academia needs to do, open these kinds of spaces. And it's a long road, but a very important one to walk together. And so I would like to invite everyone to turn on their microphones and their cameras and to applaud our speakers today and thank them for their time. And I might even also take a picture of you all for our records to show your faces if you'd like to turn on cameras here. Right, 1, 2, 3. There we go. Thank you, everyone.